Thousands turned up for the funerals of 3 Muslim students shot dead in North Carolina. Their killing has triggered a debate on whether it was a hate crime. Just what are the implications, and should Muslims in the US be worried? This is Inside Story. Hello, a warm welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thousands gathered in Raleigh, North Carolina to mourn the deaths of 3 Muslim students. Dia Barakat, his wife Yusur Abu Salha and her sister Razan were shot and killed in their apartment on Tuesday night. Each one of them was shot with a single bullet to the head. A man named Craig Hicks turned himself in the next morning. Police say the attacks might be related to a dispute over a parking space near where the victims and suspect lived. But the victims' families and many activists across the US say this was a hate crime and that the victims were targeted for their religion. We'll get to our discussion in a moment, but first, Andy Gallagher sets the story up for us from Raleigh.
This was always going to be a somber service full of raw emotion, but the local community was determined that the victims' families wouldn't be alone. Thousands came from across the region. Allahu Akbar. So many that the prayer services had to be held in a sports field instead of the local mosque. The loss of Dia Shadi Barakat, his wife Yusur Mohammed Abu Salha and her teenage sister Razan has shocked this tight-knit university town, and there is anger amongst many.
We are concerned that the rising anti-Muslim rhetoric in our society may have encouraged some to commit violence against American Muslims. So we urge the law enforcement to investigate this case as a possible hate crime.
Craig Stephen Hicks has already been charged with first-degree murder, but it's the early findings of investigators that has upset Muslim Americans. Police here believe that Hicks shot the 3 students in an argument over parking, but their families say it was a hate crime.
I do want to take this opportunity, and I won't speak much about the investigation today at all because this is a time to be together. I will just recommit that we're examining every possible investigative angle to include the potential for a hate crime.
In a smaller, more private ceremony, those who knew and loved Dia, Yusur and Razan said their final goodbyes. For their families and the local community, their loss will be deeply felt for years to come. The last few days here have been filled with sadness and displays of solidarity, but this community will now be watching the ensuing investigation closely. Many here remain convinced that this was a crime motivated by religious hatred and nothing more. The FBI have now launched their own investigation, but many here are upset that the deaths of the 3 students weren't treated as a hate crime from the beginning.
The fact that we have to think, is this a hate crime, shows where we stand as Americans. You know, as a nation. That's sad. Why is that the case?
The exact reason why 3 young lives were taken in such a senseless way may never be known, but it's not going to stop those left behind seeking answers to difficult questions. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Wendell, North Carolina.
So let's talk more about this now with our guests in Washington. We have Zainab Chowdhury, spokeswoman for the Council on American-Islamic Relations. In London, Charlie Wolf, British-based American broadcaster and political commentator. And in Cardiff, Michael Levy, Professor of Criminology at the Cardiff University School of Social Studies. Welcome to you all. Zainab Chowdhury, let me start with you. Do you believe this was a hate crime?
Well, let me just begin by saying that it's very difficult for us to not think that this is a hate crime. All of the evidence that's been collected, the investigation, of course, as we know, is still ongoing, but everything that's been revealed so far indicates that religion definitely had a role to play in this brutal attack. So even though right now it's still a little bit premature for us to say that this is a hate crime, it's very difficult for us to not think that faith had something to do with this attack.
Well, I mean, just to acknowledge what you said there, that the investigation is still at its early stages. And so far, the investigators have said that they haven't found any indications at this point that it's a hate crime. And the evidence suggests so far, from what they're saying, that this resulted in a confrontation over a parking dispute. What do you say to that?
Well, the father of Yasser and Razan, two of the victims who were brutally killed on Tuesday, his revelations indicate that Yasser, his daughter, had a very uncomfortable sense of Mr. Hicks. He had approached their door numerous times. He had flashed his gun in his holster to both Yasser and her husband, Dia. And she had indicated that she felt very uncomfortable. He had allegedly made remarks to both Dia and Yasser that made them feel very awkward. And also, it's difficult to assume, based on the fact that he has made anti-religious posts on social media, that he didn't have vitriolic views towards Islam and Muslims. So the investigation still is in its early stages, and we know the federal bureaus have gotten involved, and they're also helping with the investigation. But it's really difficult to believe that faith did not play a role. Mr. Hicks' ex-wife, the perpetrator's ex-wife, has also revealed that he was allegedly fascinated with movies in which there was rapid-fire ammunition that was used to attack people, and all of these indicators point to the fact that this was not something that was spur of the moment, attack. This was something that he harbored biases that helped for him to carry out this attack.
Charlie Wolf, how do you view the tragic events in North Carolina, and do you see it at the moment as a hate crime?
Well, first off, let me just say that it's beyond tragic. It's criminal. Looking at the photos and the short biographies of this couple and the wife's sister, they look like model American citizens that I think anybody would be proud to have as a neighbor or to have as fellow Americans. You know, they contributed to society, and I think the vast majority of the country is heartbroken over this. But that said, at this point, I don't see hate crime. Is there hate involved? Possibly. It sounded like Mr. Hicks hated everybody of any sort of religion. So is that a factor to some extent? Possibly. But the motivating factor seems to be over this parking dispute, and he seems to have had disputes with other neighbors as well. But what worries me is I'm starting to see narratives starting to develop, and narratives aren't necessarily fact. This is one of the problems we had with the Michael Brown case in Ferguson. The police officer was convicted before anyone had actually gathered any facts, and then we found out the narrative didn't meet the story. So I hope that people will stay calm and let this thing be investigated properly by the FBI and the Department of Justice and others, and let's wait and find out what the truth really is.
Michael Levy, as the academic among us, and based on what you've learned of this, does this fit the criteria of a hate crime at the moment?
It's a very difficult thing to say, because certainly if the victims were alive and accept the discussion about the way the victims felt before they were killed, that might well be classified in our country as a hate crime, which covers, it's because we have a victim-centered approach in which if the victim, who is normally alive, thinks that it's an offense motivated by race or religion, then it's a hate crime. And that's, if you like, a clear-cut approach. Unfortunately, in this case, tragically, the victims are dead. So that becomes a more ambiguous question. But it seems to me that the suspect here could be described as someone who could start a fight in an empty room. And from that point of view, it almost didn't matter, particularly if the person was visibly religious, from as he would have seen it. Then he would have gone for any religious person, Orthodox Jew, Orthodox Christian, or a Muslim-looking person. So I think it's a bit ambiguous. On the one hand, in the UK, it would have been classified as a hate crime, but I'm not sure that's the best way of seeing it.
Charlie Wolf, you said earlier that you don't see this case at the moment as being a hate crime, and it's been suggested that there is a double standard at play here, and that if the situation was reversed, if these three people were white Americans, for example, and that they had been, that the attacker happened to be Muslim, that the law enforcement and the media wouldn't hesitate to call this a hate crime or even a terrorist act. What do you say to that?
Yes, that's true, and you have to look at the environment. Unfortunately, when you look at what's happening in the Middle East with the Islamic State, when you're seeing people immolated, when you're seeing people beheaded, etc., when you know that there's a call for worldwide jihad against the West, when you have the Fort Hood shooting, etc., or Paris and the Charlie Hebdo offices in the kosher supermarket, then that seems to be an easy conclusion to make. Whereas on the other hand, let's just, for the moment, for argument's sake, presuppose this was a hate crime. I just don't see atheists gathering together, conspiring against the America's Muslim population. You know, again, even if there is hate involved in this, as the professor said, he seems to have hated everybody. But even if it was specifically Muslims, I don't see where there's some sort of a conspiracy to specifically target and kill Muslims.
Zainab Chaudhry, you mentioned earlier that, you said, of course, that you believe this was a hate crime and that you felt that there was evidence that showed that the attacker harbored feelings against Islam. Do you have any examples specifically that show that? I mean, it is, from what we know, he was an avowed atheist and he was opposed to religion in general. But what about Islam specifically?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I didn't say that I think it's a hate crime. I think that it's very difficult to believe that it's not a hate crime, just based on the revelations that have been revealed so far to us, especially based on the father's testimony of how his daughters felt very uncomfortable around this individual. I think it's also important to point out that it took the media, national media and global media, a long time to cover the story. As you had mentioned earlier, that had the victims been atheists and had the perpetrator been Muslim, then it would have been all over the news. This incident occurred around 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it took about 15 hours before a major media outlet picked up the story. And even that was after a flurry of activity on social media that pointed the fact that this was a story that had not been picked up and it was not being reported. I think that the faith of the individuals, the victims, should not play a role in whether or not the story is being reported. While terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram, they do have their own agendas and they are very vitriolic towards the West, I think it's also important to understand that they do not reflect the views of mainstream Muslims. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and these organizations represent a very tiny fringe minority of the world's Muslim population. But unfortunately, especially with certain media outlets that have a fixation that tend to provide a platform for these kind of organizations to spread their propaganda, unfortunately it does create and instill fear and hatred towards Islam and Muslims. Whether or not that had a role to play in this particular situation, it's hard to say. We don't know what Mr. Hicks was thinking at the time when he committed his execution, because that's exactly what it was. It was, I mean, any time that you point blank at such close range, you kill people the way that he did these individuals. I mean, people don't normally react that way to a parking spot, to a confrontation over a parking spot. So it's hard to think that faith did not play a role, but that should never justify the actions of organizations like terrorist organizations like ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda should never justify this kind of horrible act. The deaths of these 3 people, it has rocked not only North Carolina, but Muslim communities all across the nation and really all across the globe. It's really affected us profoundly on multiple levels. People are terrified. They're afraid of being victimized. They're afraid of being subjected to hate crimes, and nobody should be made to feel that way because of their religion.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of those themes now, because some say there is a growing Islamophobia in many Western countries, and this may have a direct link to attacks committed by armed groups like ISIL. And we show you that now. Just about a month ago, gunmen in Paris stormed the offices of Charlie Hebdo magazine. They killed 12 people, and they say they did it because the magazine ridiculed Islam's Prophet Muhammad. In Nigeria, the Council on Foreign Relations in Africa says Boko Haram has killed more than 7,000 people there last year alone. And of course, fighting associated with ISIL, as has been mentioned, has forced many Syrians and Iraqis to become refugees, and at least 9 hostages were killed by the armed group, and videos of their murders were posted online. Charlie Wolf, if I could turn back to you on this, obviously with everything that's happened in the news, as we mentioned there, with ISIL and Boko Haram, much of this has contributed to this idea of increased Islamophobia. What's your view on that?
I don't know if it's necessarily Islamophobia. I do agree with what Zainab was saying earlier, that there's perceptions. I think that's what she has to realize is news is done on perception. The story did take a while to catch on, but news editors are looking at a whole multitude of things when they're putting a running order together. There's a lot of news, what stories you choose and why, how it affects your listeners or your viewers in a locale. And I think initially this was viewed, and I don't think there was any reason to think otherwise, as a local crime over a parking spot. And to Zainab's saying, well, if it was the other way around, again, perception is a reality. You know, what I agreed with, I'm sorry, I never said what I agreed with, was the fact of, yes, ISIL and Al-Qaeda, etc., represent a very, very small part of the Muslim community. But unfortunately, they seem to be taking the lead right now and getting the press through their actions. And it's a worrying thing for not just people who are of the West, but for Muslims as well. But that's what goes into the picking of news stories. I don't think there's a bias or a hatred of Muslims or an Islamophobia. Again, it's just looking at perceptions, it's looking at facts on the ground, what people know, what they don't know. So I just don't think there was any sort of conspiracy or desire to be Islamophobic in not nationally covering this story.
Michael Levy, does society treat hate crimes among different groups differently, depending on whether they happen to be Muslims or Jews or any other group? Yes,
I mean, I think there is obviously the way people in those particular groups feel that way. And you know, I share Zina's concern about the effects on the population. But yes, society does treat different groups in a different way, depending on how sympathetic or unsympathetic they believe them to be, right or wrong. And I think that is something that it's the job of educators and the media to try and sort out in balanced programs like this one. But you know, there are a lot of killings of this kind, whether Muslims are victims or not. We don't have many in this country because our citizens don't generally carry guns, and that's a huge difference. But you can have violent attacks of this kind and quarrels. But I don't myself think that this was a particular example of Islamophobia by the suspect or offender. But I do think that people are right to be worried, and I can understand Muslim sensitivities about whether they're being undervalued in the treatment of this case.
Zainab Chowdhury, what would you like to, I mean, as somebody who lives in the United States, in a country that prides itself on its diversity, on treating people the same regardless of their creed or their ethnicity, what do you want to see more of in your community and in the country as a whole that you're not seeing enough of right now?
I would definitely like to see a more balanced narrative in the media. I think that especially because that has such a huge, tremendous impact on public perception. As you had mentioned earlier, of course, groups like ISIS and Boko Haram and terrorists, they're engaged in horrific attacks all across the world. And unfortunately, whenever they do perpetrate attack, that's what we see in the media. The global headlines catch on to that, and there's a vicious, repetitive news cycle that impacts the psyche of the general public when they watch these kind of headlines on television and listen to it on the radio. There are other groups who are non-Muslim groups who are committing acts of atrocities against Muslim groups as well, but we never hear about that. In Uganda, the Lord's Resistance Army has been persecuting Muslims for many, many years. In Burma, the Rohingya Muslims have been persecuted for many, many years, but we'll never hear about that on the news. I think it's important to have a very balanced narrative and to allow the mainstream American Muslims to shape and form their own narrative. And part of that means exactly what we're doing now, elevating the voices of the moderate majority to stamp out the rhetoric that the extremist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram attempt to convey through their propaganda.
Charlie Wolf, we talked there about... Yeah, go ahead, Charlie Wolf.
Just briefly, and just in regards to what Zainab was saying, news is local. So the reason you generally would not hear stories of the different groups she mentioned in these other countries is it doesn't have necessarily an effect on the American population. Unfortunately, the ISILs of the world, though they're not operating necessarily in the United States, they are inspiring people in the United States, or trying to inspire people in the United States, and they do call for jihad in the United States. So that's why a news editor would find that story interesting and not necessarily talk about the other ones, unless maybe you were talking about NPR or an international station such as here on Al Jazeera.
What about the...
Which is a very important point.
Yeah, go ahead, Zainab.
Which is a very important point. And to that, I would also say not that it justifies the actions that they're engaged in or that they're involved in, that these groups are involved in, but I think it's important for us to also analyze our own policies. What is it on our end that's creating this kind of vitriolic attitude towards Americans and towards the West? Unfortunately, our government has been engaged in controversial acts, and our policies have impacted negatively, predominantly on the Muslim world, post 9/11, after the advent of the war on terror. And human rights abuses that have occurred at prisons like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay facility, where prisoners have been tortured. I think in drone strikes in places like Yemen and Pakistan. Well, not that this justifies.
Yeah, I was going to say, with respect, and I appreciate your saying it doesn't justify, but I think that's a bit of a moral relativism. There is a real threat, unfortunately, in the United States. It's a bona fide threat from terrorism, and unfortunately, by Muslim groups, Muslim extremists. And I think the quote originally from the editor of Al Arabiya years ago, just after 9/11, was that not all Muslims are terrorists, but unfortunately all terrorists, at least the majority of, are Muslim. And that's the position we're in. And it's unfortunate, and I don't want to see harm come to my Muslim friends or the Muslim community in the United States, but we have to fight this thing honestly and understand it for what it is. Now, it doesn't mean I want to see harm befall you or anybody else.
I would challenge that statement with all due respect. With all due respect, I would challenge that statement that most terrorists are Muslims. I think we should really define the word terrorist and have a discussion, have an open discussion about what that word connotates. I mean, I would very well say that Mr. Hicks is also a terrorist. Anybody who has a capacity to shoot anybody over, whether it's a parking spot or whether it's a more important issue or more significant matter, anybody who's capable of committing that kind of crime, I would say that they too are a terrorist.
Well,
yet in the media we see headlines that...
Well, I don't have...
I think
I don't have much time for
Charlie,
Mr. Hicks. I think he's a murderer, but...
I'll let you respond to that briefly, and then I want to bring in Michael Levy just in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think we go down, I hate to use the expression, but we go down the slippery slope of, all are terrorists, or how you define a terrorist. I think we have to have an understanding. And again, the major threat right now is from groups that are inspiring lone wolves, et cetera. And that doesn't mean one is trying to be anti-Muslim. It's just stating a fact, and we have to be honest about it.
Michael Levy, what's your take on all of this, and how does the 24 news cycle and social media contribute to all of this? Is it a force for good, or can it work the other way as well?
Well, I think it can work the other way pretty easily. I mean, unfortunately, we do tend to get rather inflamed quite quickly, and we rush to snap judgments. But terrorism has not been satisfactorily defined in international law. But at least I think we should see it as something aimed at causing widespread terror elsewhere. And I'm not sure that this particular case, although it may have that unintended effect, was really intended to broadcast widespread terror amongst Muslims or any other group in the population. In that sense, I think it's wrong to call it a terrorist attack.
And on that note, we are going to have to leave it there. We are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank all three of our guests for taking part: Zainab Chowdhury, Charlie Wolf, and Michael Levy. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you for joining us on another edition of the show. Remember, if you have anything you want to add to today's show, you can go to our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments to us at Facebook. We're on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, we're on Twitter. Just send your tweets to us at AJ Inside Story is the address. I'm Hazem Sika from the whole team. Bye for now.